Yeah, so I thought I would just say a bit about researching learner autonomy in contexts. So I'm really, I guess as a teacher, I'm interested in learner autonomy. I've always been interested in it. As a researcher, I've kind of looked at learning more broadly, not only language learning, but different kinds of learning of content in different kinds of environments. And I've always been interested in kind of anthropology and ethnography. So I come at it from that kind of angle. So I'm going to talk about some work which I've published in the past, some frameworks really. I'm going to talk about some frameworks for research. I'll talk about some which I've published in the past and how they've been developed, and then I'm going to say a bit about a research framework which I came across recently not in language learning, not in learner autonomy, but in other fields, called practical epistemology analysis, which I think might have some potential, and it throws up some interesting research questions. So I'm interested in, as I say, in autonomy in context. So learner autonomy is like a capacity for taking control of your own learning, as it's put, and how that is actually carried out, how it's instantiated, and how you might see it happening, happens in particular contexts. So, language learners, they might be in a class, okay, so that's where I would often come across learners, and most of us would have some experience of that kind of setting. So, students in a class, there's an example here. So in that context, now you can't actually see the teacher in that picture, but the teacher is part of the context there, but also all the other people around the student there. They're in a particular room, sitting in a particular way. So what does it mean to be an autonomous learner or to become a more autonomous learner in that kind of context? And then we've got sort of institutional but more less structured settings, like learning centres. I said learning centre here. I mean, the picture here is from primary school with learners who are in a, as you see, moderately unstructured setting. I mean, it's structured by some activities that they've got with them and some materials that they have. But again, there's no teacher there, although he or she may well be behind the scenes. So what does it mean to be autonomous in this kind of situation? So it might be that kind of setting. It might be an advising centre. It might be a writing centre. Different kinds of environments like this, which are kind of institutionally structured but less like a classroom. And then there are kind of very like structured institutional but outside the institution settings, like homework. Yeah, so these are settings where a learner is doing something which may be very guided by the teacher, or it may be something that's left open to the learner what they're doing, but it's basically assigned within the institution, but then they have to at least manage the doing of the homework, possibly do a lot of planning and so on for the homework. And then we have autonomy in the wild, as they say. So these people sitting here are just kind of getting on with their lives and socializing, and maybe somebody might be at work, or they might be traveling, or they might be in all kinds of settings. So what does it mean to be autonomous and to learn in this context? So I'm thinking about a whole range of settings, and one of the ways. Yes. One of the ways which I've looked at this is by thinking about the different kinds of resources which surround you in different situations. So, for example, I've written before about material resources, like things, like we have some books down here. So that's one of the main, a very common material resource which learners might use. Now, it might be a course book, it might be a grammar reference book, it might be a novel. So there's all different kinds of books and documents which can be a resource for learning. And there also can be less tangible, I mean, I call them material resources, but it also includes things like websites, online infrastructure for which can be used for learning. Perhaps not specifically designed for learning, but which can be used as a learning resource. And then social resources, so anybody around us or anybody that we might be in contact with is a potential resource which can be drawn on for and contributed to for learning. And then discursive resources, what I call discursive resources. So this is kind of concepts for and attitudes and these kind of things which surround people's use of material resources and social resources. So a mobile, we've got a mobile here, so it's a material resource in the sense that it's a piece of hardware and you have to hold it in your hand and manipulate it. And it can give access to social spaces, which could be a social resource for language learning. And also that happens within a certain kind of approach to the mobile. So what attitude do you have to your mobile? Is it a like an e-leash, or is it something which gives you access to a whole world of information? Or do people stop you using it sometimes, or what do you use it for? So there's all these concepts and knowledge around it. So that's what I've referred to as discursive resources. So a couple of studies, just for example, recently, Trinder 2015, this was looking at technology specifically, how people use technology. And she found that people were very technologically engaged, in that they were very used to, of course, nowadays, very used to technology, used to using all different kinds of technology for work, for entertainment and so on. But they didn't necessarily take advantage of the language learning potential of things like Skype or other kinds of online or technological resources. They didn't. So there was a kind of disconnect between the realms that they would access for all sorts of other, for the rest of their life, but not for language learning so much. And then another study, for example, New et al. Is looking at a similar kind of thing, but from the point of view of activity theory. So you might be familiar with activity theory. So this is really a theory about how people do things in life and get on with activities of all kinds. And the model that they have is based on artifacts, which is kind of like the material resources. So objects, and rules, which is kind of norms in society or in particular groups, or which individuals use, communities in which they form a part. So for example, in this study, the researchers looked at these different things: artifacts, rules, community roles, and how learners leveraged them to learn. And so communities, for example, were the class community or the school community or the family, or different groups who somehow contributed or were drawn on for language learning. And then roles. So people have different roles. So a role as a student, as a teacher. Somebody has a role as a father, a brother, a friend, a work colleague, and so how these played a part in their language learning. Now, so from activity theory, I wanted to tell you about this framework which I came across recently. I don't know how familiar it is to people in general, but practical epistemology analysis. I came across it in a paper on about health information and how people get hold of health information. And it has some interesting, it throws up some interesting questions, which I thought might be good research questions to think about all kinds of learning situations and autonomy in those situations. So the first question, the first element is purpose. So I've written, okay, so what is the purpose of learners' engagement with, now, I put language learning resources, and then I thought, well, a lot of things that people interact with, that learners interact with, they don't think of them as language learning resources necessarily. So they, using Instagram, for example, is not something that people think of as language learning resource, but it might be something that they do intensively. So what is the purpose of them engaging with that? So I'd kind of like to replace language learning resources with these different kinds of resources: material, social, discursive resources. So what is why are, for example, in one study I looked at, why are teenagers going on Instagram? What is their aim in doing that? In posting pictures, in commenting, in liking. It could be a learning purpose. It could be a kind of public presentation purpose. It could be a way of establishing social relations with people. So that's the big context. What is the purpose for it? And then what or who do learners encounter? So this is related very much to the different kinds of resource. So they encounter, for example, particular images on Instagram, or they encounter particular people in life, in situations. So they come into particular situations and they meet resources. I mean, what I'm calling resources. They meet people, this laptop, the school, different kinds of people and things. And when they encounter them, their gaps come up. So gaps in practical epistemology analysis, it's often gaps in knowledge. So they find, they don't know something, and so they go and look it up, or they interact with something which is surprising. They see something surprising, so there's a gap between their expectations and the thing that they see. So it could be, so it's kind of related to learning needs, which would be a familiar concept, but also information needs, maybe performance needs, like wanting to be a good student, or wanting to be a trendy teenager, or whatever. And I thought there was an interesting connection with what Curtis was saying, actually, about discrepancy. So this gap is kind of like a discrepancy. And like the discrepancies between selves, these gaps in knowledge or gaps in information can be negative things, or they can be positive. So there are different results that can come out of them. And then a crucial thing is, what do learners do to fill these gaps? So maybe they ask somebody, or they look something up, or they think about something and they're making maybe connections between this experience and other experiences they've had, or between this person and other people they know. So these I see as quite key, these parts here, the gaps and the relations. And then another very thing which is often forgotten but needs to be taken into account is what is not perceived as a gap. So what is not questioned? So people have habits, people have ideas, and the whole point of bridging a gap is that you bridge from something that you know, or that you think you know, to something new that you've encountered, or something that you want to attain. So it's important to look at the assumptions that they make. So a learner in an advising centre, what assumptions do they have about what is going to be effective, or about what they want to achieve? So things which are taken for granted in the conversation. So I thought these might throw up some interesting research questions about learner autonomy. Now, I haven't found any studies about learner autonomy or even very much about language learning using practical epistemology analysis. But I'll just show you one example from this is a lesson, this is a science lesson, so it's from a classroom setting. It's a science lesson in Sweden about coniferous forests. And the class has several learners who are Arabic speakers, and some of them, one girl in particular has quite recently arrived in Sweden and doesn't know much Swedish, hasn't really seen a coniferous forest. And so there's a gap here that comes up. So, so there's rather a lot in the table, but if you, maybe the right-hand column would help you to understand what's going on, and the transcription column shows what they say. The bold shows that it's in Arabic, and then the part which is not in bold in English was actually originally in Swedish. So, so this is a paper about translanguaging in science classes, and so basically they're discussing about different kinds of forest, coniferous forest, and at the beginning, Furkan, this student, says, is trying to explain, and she says there's a tree that means they have leaves. She says leaves in Swedish, but and then Adnan adds the word in Arabic, the word for leaves, and then Furkan tries to explain about needles on a tree, on a a pine tree, which is an unfamiliar concept to Halima, who's the girl at the centre of all this. So she says, only leaves, like leaves, but with needles, like little hard sticks. And you can see on the right-hand side that there she grabs a plastic potted plant on the table and shows the leaves on that to try and explain. And Halima doesn't say anything. And Adnan tries saying, small hard sticks in Arabic. And then Maria, the teaching assistant, comes in with, tries to help with, does she know what a Christmas tree is? So all of this is kind of work going on around Halima to try and bridge this gap of understanding the lesson content. And they use different languages, so they're using Arabic and Swedish. They're using comparisons with things she might know, like leaves. They're using a plastic plant on the table. The teacher is referring to a cultural idea about a Christmas tree. These are more or less successful in bridging the gap. I mean, no response from Halima suggests that it may be low in that. So, for example, in this one, who is being autonomous? In a way that they're being quite active learners, and as a group, maybe they are taking control of Halima's learning in a positive way. Like the group is building up some way to try and bridge this gap of comprehension. So I need to stop there, but this is hopefully giving you a kind of framework. As I say, it's been used in studies of, like health information and understanding science, things like that, but not so much in relation to autonomy and language learning. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and you might find it interesting to look into.